I want to talk about something that I think is going to affect a lot of people watching this. And I'll be honest, it's affected how I'm thinking about my own situation too. In the 2024 autumn budget, the government announced that from April 2027, unused pension funds are going to be brought into your estate for inheritance tax purposes. Now, what that means in plain English is that right now, if you die and there's money left in your pension, it generally passes outside of your estate. Your family gets it without it being counted for inheritance tax. And that's been the rule for years. It's one of the reasons pensions have been such a powerful planning tool for people. But from April 2027, that changes. Your unused pension gets added to everything else you own. Your house, your savings, your investments. And if that total is above the threshold, 40% of everything above it goes to HMRC. Now, I've got a mortgage-free home, a rental property, a pension, ISAs, and a 14-year-old son that I really want to protect. So yeah, this is personal for me. But here's the thing, and I want to be upfront about this from the start. I've got a moral compass, and that's in direct conflict with my personal circumstances on this one. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because I think that conflict is worth talking about honestly. And I suspect that many of you probably feel exactly the same way. And before I go any further, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not trying to be one, never. What I'm doing here is making sure you know this is coming and understand the shape of it. Your situation is your own. Please do get proper advice before making any decisions based on anything I say in this video. So let me just lay out what we actually know, because there's a lot of noise around this and I want to try and be as accurate as I possibly can. This was announced in the autumn budget in October 2024. The government published draft legislation in July 2025. But the direction of travel is clear. Pensions are coming into scope for inheritance tax from the 6th of April 2027. And what that means practically is that your unused defined contribution pension, your workplace pension, your personal pension, your SIP, they'll all be included in the value of your estate when you die. And if your total estate is above the inheritance tax threshold, 40% of everything above that is taxable. And the current inheritance tax threshold is £325,000, I believe. And there's an additional residence nil rate band of £175,000 if you're passing a property to a direct descendants like your children. So for a single person, that's potentially £500,000 before inheritance tax kicks in. For a couple, it can effectively double, so potentially up to £1 million between you. Above those thresholds, it's 40%. Now, I do want to be clear about something important. The final legislation isn't yet fully in place. It's still working its way through Parliament, but the direction is confirmed. The government has been clear that this is happening. But some of the detail is still being worked out. So everything I say today is based on what's been announced and the draft legislation, not the finished law. Which means, and I'll keep on saying this, check your own situation with someone qualified. Don't make decisions based on a YouTube video, including this one. What I'm doing here is making sure you know that this is coming, because a lot of people don't. And here's the scale of it. The government estimates that around 10,500 more estates per year will become liable for inheritance tax because of this change. And that sounds like a small number. But if you've spent 30 years building a pension, you own a property, and you have some savings on top, there's a real chance that your estate's in scope, more than you might think. And here's why I think this lands slightly differently if you're in your 50s. Because when you're in your 30s or your 40s, your pension's a distant thing. You're contributing to it, you're vaguely aware it's growing, but you're not sitting there calculating what happens to it when you die. Because in your mind, you've got decades and you'll figure that out later. When you're in your 50s, and I suspect this is true for a lot of people, the picture starts to become more into your focus. You can see the shape of what you're going to have. You start thinking about whether it's enough. And something in the back of your mind, depending on how things go, you start to think about what happens to what's left. For me, it's never been primarily about leaving Jake a fortune. That's not my goal. I want him to have enough that he doesn't ever have to worry, as any parent would, but not so much that it removes his reason to build something on his own. And that tension is real for me. I think about it quite a bit. But the idea that I spent decades building something as a safety net for my retirement, excuse me, and that if I don't spend it all, 40% of what's left gets taken away, well, that also sits uncomfortably for me. And not because I think I'm entitled to pass everything on, but more because the rules have changed after I'd been playing a different set of rules for 30 years. And I think that's the part that feels like betrayal for a lot of people. Not the tax itself, the retrospective quality of it. You built your plan around a set of assumptions, and the government has decided to change those assumptions. And you find out about it in a budget speech. Now, I know I'd vaguely heard about this, but I hadn't properly looked at it until recently. And when I did, when I actually sat down and thought about what it means for our situation, our two properties, our pension, and what we want for Jake, I realised this is something I need to get proper advice on, and soon, because 2027's not far away. Now, I said at the start that I have a moral compass, which is in conflict with my personal circumstances here. And I want to talk about that and be honest about that, because I think pretending it doesn't exist would be dishonest. Now, inheritance tax exists for a reason. The idea behind it is that wealth shouldn't just compound endlessly through generations, widening the gap between people who were born with assets behind them and people who weren't. And that's not an unreasonable position. I understand it. I even agree with it, mainly. The people who are going to be most affected by this pension change, though, are not the ultra-wealthy. The ultra-wealthy have accountants and trusts and structures designed to manage exactly this kind of thing. The people most affected by this are people like you watching this video. People who worked for 30 or 40 years, saved carefully, bought a house, built a pension, and now find themselves in the firing line of a tax that was designed for a different kind of wealth. And I think that's where the edge comes from for me. Not the principle of the tax, but the targeting of it. Because there's a difference between inherited wealth and a pension pot built by someone who worked their whole life and didn't spend it all before they died. Those feel like different things to me. And the treatment of them as equivalent, well, that's what makes me uncomfortable. But I also know that if you said to me, Dave, Would you rather the people who have nothing paid more tax so the people who have something could pass it on untouched? I wouldn't say yes to that. I just wouldn't. So where does that leave me? Probably in the same place I think a lot of you may be. Uncomfortable with the change. Understanding why some version of it probably does make sense. And trying to figure out what it means for my family specifically. Now, I know that's not a clean answer, but it's the honest one. So let me try and make this concrete without turning it into some kind of tax lecture, because I'm not, qualified to go down that route. The question you need to answer for yourself is, what would your total estate look like if you died tomorrow? And I mean everything. Your home, any other property you may have, your pension, ISAs, savings, investments. Add it all up. Roughly if you like, but be honest about it. Then compare that to the threshold, which for a couple passing assets to their children can be up to £1 million before inheritance tax applies. Now, if you're comfortably under that, this change probably doesn't affect you significantly. The government's own estimate is that only around 8% of estates could be liable. But if you own your home outright, and a lot of people at our age in the late 50s do, and you've got a reasonable pension and maybe some savings on top, you might be a lot closer to that threshold than you think, especially once you add your pension in. And for us, a mortgage-free home, lucky to have a rental property, a pension, ISAs. Now, I haven't sat down and properly calculated the number yet, but I'm fairly sure we're going to be well in scope. And that means decisions. Decisions that I thought we had time to defer, and now we probably don't. And the second question, and again, this is something to take to a qualified advisor, not figure out from a YouTube video, is whether there are things you'd be doing differently knowing this is coming. And I'm not talking about tax avoidance or any kind of dodgy schemes or not so dodgy schemes. Just, are there legitimate ways to think about how and when you draw from your pension, what you use for income, what you do with other assets that are worth thinking about now rather than in 2027 when the rules are already in force? And I'm not the person to answer that. But hopefully I am the person to tell you that the question exists. And that 2 years can go by pretty quickly. Another thing worth knowing, if you're passing your pension to a spouse or civil partner, it's still exempt. So it's worth knowing that. The change primarily affects what you pass to children or others who aren't your spouse. So if your situation is that your pension passes to your partner first and then your children later, the calculation could be different. But get proper advice on how that works in your specific situation. Because here's what I keep coming back to. We spend our 50s in this strange in-between place. Not young enough to pretend we've got unlimited time to sort things out, but not old enough to feel like the end is something we need to be actively planning around, hopefully. And so things that probably need attention, like looking at your total estate picture, like actually understanding what happens to your pension when you do pass, they get put off. Not because we don't care, but because life is busy and it doesn't quite feel urgent yet. Well, this change makes it urgent. And I don't want you to go off in a panic about this. This is something you need to understand and probably get some proper advice on before 2027, rather than go into blind panic. Because once the rules change, your options will likely change too. And the people that you've thought about I guess the people that have thought about this in advance will be in a much better position than those who find out about it at the wrong moment. And for me, this video is partly me talking to myself and trying to persuade myself to start making some calls that I have been putting off. To look at the whole picture properly, understanding what our estate actually looks like, having the conversations with my wife about Jake, about what we actually want to leave him, and about the smart way to think about this. And look, let's be really, really open here. They're coming for it. That's the honest truth. Every time there's a budget, something else gets brought into scope. Another threshold gets frozen. Another loophole gets closed. I'm not surprised by this. I'm not even particularly shocked. I just think people deserve to know it's happening. Not from a letter suddenly one day from the HMRC, but from someone who's in the same situation or very similar situation to what they're in. Someone who looked at it this week and thought, I need to talk about this. So if this landed for you, if it made you think about something in your own situation you haven't properly looked at yet, please do me the honour of subscribing. Because that's the only reason for me that this channel exists. Not to give advice and not to pretend by a long way that I've got it figured out. Just to make sure that you know the questions. When I do, I guess, you may know more than me. And tell me in the comments, had you heard about this? Had you looked at what it means for your own estate? So I'd really like to know how people in their 50s have actually sat down and done this calculation. Because I hadn't, well, not properly, not until this week. And I'll see you in the next one.